All right, hello class, thank you so much for joining me today. So this lecture is the beginning of our last unit in this class, which is focused on labor market discrimination. And before I dive into what we're going to talk about today, right, the nitty-gritty of today's lecture, I want to give us a little bit of a sense of big picture, right, of where this lecture fits into everything we've done so far. So I almost feel like our class up to this point has kind of presented two competing visions of how labor markets work. The first vision, which comes out of our first two units, right, the first half of this class, but also really comes out of the human capital theory, is a vision where how much someone is paid, right, what their wage is, really reflects how much that person produces of value for the economy, right? We said that in competitive labor markets, you're going to end up earning a wage equal to marginal revenue product. We've then thought about wage inequality, right, differences in the wages that different kinds of people are able to earn, as functionally being a consequence of differences in those workers' productivity. Whether those differences come from different education, right, different labor market experience and on-the-job training, or even things like different physical locations, right? So that the exact same person located in India might earn less than that person would earn if they were located in the United States, right? But in any case, if we want to think about raising people's wages, improving people's quality of life through their labor market participation, we need to think about how to raise people's productivity. And if we want to think about things like rising inequality over time, we're going to mostly understand that, right? In this first vision of the economy, we're going to mostly understand that rising inequality over time as being a combination of a product of technological changes that make certain kinds of skill more valuable, right? Increase some people's productivity and decrease other people's productivity, and or a consequence of different access to opportunities to improve your skills. Right? Changes in the degree to which our economy is producing higher levels of education over time, as we talked about in the race between education and technology. Right? In this first vision, wages reflect real productivity, right? More highly paid people are genuinely more valuable to the economy. Trying to think about things like inequality or wage growth means thinking about how to make less productive people more productive. Cool, so that's kind of vision one. Vision two of the labor market comes out of our unit on market power. Right, when we thought about what happens when people are trying to sell their labor in non-competitive or less competitive labor markets. And the key implication of that set of theory and empirics is that when people don't have a perfectly competitive labor market to sell their labor to, their wages aren't just a function of their productivity, they're also a function of a worker's bargaining position, right? Which is to say, the amount of power that a worker has relative to the amount of power that their employer has. So when we think about market power, all of a sudden we're able to say things like, if you have two workers who are equally productive, right, equally valuable, equally skilled, but one worker has a wider range of potential employers to work for than the other, the worker with a wider range of potential employers, because they have better bargaining position, is going to end up earning more money, right? Not because their skills are more valuable, not because their output is more valuable, but because they're better able to negotiate with their boss, right? They're able to get a better deal for themselves. So in the second vision of the economy, we can think about wages and compensation as really being a product of a power struggle, right, between workers and employees. And we can think about things like rising wage inequality as representing certain groups within society losing that power struggle, right, losing the battle to get paid based on what they produce. So what we're doing now, right, what we're doing starting today, is we're thinking about the way that prejudices in society, right, negative beliefs about people on the basis of things like their race or their ethnicity, right, their sex or gender, their sexual orientation or sexual identity, right, their national origin. Prejudices on the basis of these sorts of characteristics that don't affect people's real productivity are going to influence, we're going to think about how and when those are going to influence people's ability to earn a living, right? How and when they're going to influence people's employment opportunities, how and when they're going to influence people's wages. And we're going to start doing this by going back to some of the earliest theory, trying to understand the economics of discrimination, which dates back to a thesis written by Gary Becker in the 1950s, that essentially tries to understand this by saying, let's imagine that different people in society are prejudiced, right? They essentially meaning that they're willing to give up money in order to avoid interacting with groups of people in society they consider undesirable. How and when is that prejudice going to affect the wages and job opportunities of people experiencing that prejudice, right? Of disadvantaged groups in society. The way these models work is they think through the implications of prejudice on the part of three different actors who play an important role in a labor market. So we're going to think about what happens when employers are prejudiced, what happens when customers are prejudiced, and then finally what happens when other employees are prejudiced. So let's start with employers. The basic framework in this model is that we're in a competitive labor market and a competitive product market. So what this means is that from any particular employer's perspective, there's a prevailing wage at which that employer can hire white workers, and a prevailing wage at which that employer can hire non-white workers. The employer has no power to set the wage, right? It's set by the market. All they can do is decide whether they're going to hire white workers, non-white workers, or both, and decide how many workers they want to hire. Furthermore, we're going to start out by imagining a situation where employers are unprejudiced towards white workers, but are prejudiced towards non-white workers. So how that's going to look in this model is that from the perspective of the employer, the perceived cost of hiring a white worker is just that worker's wage. Which we're going to call the wage white, right? WW. On the other hand, the perceived cost of hiring a non-white worker is going to be the wage paid to that worker plus the degree to which this particular employer has prejudice or distaste towards non-white workers. So we'll say for a non-white worker, they're going to perceive the cost to be the wage paid to a non-white worker, which I'll call WNW, plus D, where D here is some sort of distaste toward minority workers. I'm going to say non-white workers. Because, this model could still hold in a situation where white workers were not the majority. Cool. So, in addition to this, in addition to saying that there's these differences in perceived cost, we're going to say that there's no other differences between white and non-white workers. In other words, we're going to say that in terms of the production function of the firm, which we're not going to bother writing out, but in terms of the production function of the firm, white workers and non-white workers are perfect substitutes with identical levels of productivity, right? There's no difference whatsoever between the kind of tasks that these two kinds of workers play. There's no difference in their ability to do these tasks. The only difference between these two groups of workers is that employers discriminate against one group and they don't discriminate against the other group. Okay, so given these assumptions, what do we expect a firm to do? Well, essentially what they're going to do is they're going to say, if white workers and non-white workers are identical to each other, I'm going to hire whichever group of workers I perceive to be cheapest. And, if one group's cheaper than the other, I'll only hire the cheap group, right? If both groups are equally expensive, I'll be indifferent, right? I'll hire whoever walks into my store. Because we're imagining that labor markets are perfectly competitive, there's never going to be a reason to hire a worker who's more expensive than another worker, because you can hire as many workers as you want, right, at the prevailing wage. So what this means is we're going to say that the employer decision right, hire whoever's cheapest, which is going to mean that if the white wage is less than the non-white wage plus discrimination, we'll only hire whites. If the white wage was greater than the non-white wage plus discrimination, we'll only hire non-whites. And if they're equal, we'll hire whoever. This make sense? Cool. So the clear implication of this is going to be that if every employer agreed about D, right? In other words, if every employer in the market had the same level of distaste towards hiring non-white workers, the consequence would have to be that we would end up in this situation if we had any white employees hired or any non-white employees hired, right? And as a result of this, the difference between WW and WNW in a competitive market would just be given by D, right? Essentially what we'd say is that the wage gap between white and non-white workers would be set by the distaste of employers. On top of this, we would expect that in a competitive equilibrium, employment rates would also be lower for non-white workers than for white workers, assuming that the supply of labor for these two groups of workers was identical. So we can think about this by writing down a simple labor supply, labor demand graph, right, where we've got number of workers and we've got a wage. Let's imagine that the supply of white workers is given by some upward sloping supply curve and was exactly equal to the labor supply of non-white workers. Oh, sorry, getting confused with all the different W's. I assume you guys are too. We're also going to have labor demand, which is going to be just given by some downward sloping curve. Now, while the labor supply of white and non-white workers is actually identical with respect to wages, right? Employers are going to perceive non-white workers to be more costly than they actually are due to this level of discrimination, right? Due to D. So they're going to act like the labor supply of non-white workers is something like this, right? Where this difference here is given by D. Right? In other words, if the level of discrimination was $2 and you're actually available to work for $8 an hour, employers are going to treat you like you're available to work for $10 an hour. So as a consequence of this, our aggregate labor supply curve, just the horizontal sum of our white and non-white labor supply curves, right? So it's going to have a slope that is steeper, or sorry, flatter, right from the first, greater increase in L for an increase in W, right, with respect to the perceived cost. We're going to end up with an equilibrium wage right here. That's an equilibrium wage for white workers, right, because this is essentially telling us demand and supply of labor as a function of the perceived cost to employers, which is equal to wage only for white workers. So what this is going to mean is that our employment rate of white workers is going to be given here, right? The number of white workers willing to work at wage WW. On the other hand, our employment rate of non-white workers is going to be here, because non-white workers are not going to receive the full wage, right, WW. They're going to receive a lower wage that's lower by this discrimination coefficient. So we've got a wage non-white, right, given by wage white minus D, and we'll have employment rate that's also lower. This makes sense? Great. Now, the only problem with this analysis that we just did is that we've assumed that every employer has the same level of prejudice against non-white workers, right? They all share some level of discrimination D, or distaste D. But that's unlikely to be true in the real world. We might think that some employers are going to be very prejudiced, other employers might not be prejudiced at all. So what's this model going to predict when we have different levels of prejudice among different types of employers, right? Let's imagine in particular that we had some situation. Let's say we had 100 employers. We were going to rank them from the least prejudiced, who we'll call number 1, to the most prejudiced, who we'll call 100, right? So this is going to be percentile of employer prejudice. Make sense? We might want to think about, right, we could describe basically the prejudice in the market by thinking about the discrimination coefficient D for each of these different employers, right? Ranging from the least to the most prejudiced. And just to draw a picture, right, this could look like any number of things. Let's say that we've got something that looks like this, right? Point here, and I'm trying not to make this a straight line, but otherwise this has no meaning, right? So we could have some maximum. Let's say the most prejudiced employer would be willing to pay $10 more for a white worker rather than a non-white worker. And at the minimum, the least prejudiced employer doesn't care at all whether workers are white or non-white, right? It has no preference at all for white workers over non-white workers. So what do we expect to happen to equilibrium wages in this model, right? How much do we expect white workers to be paid? How much do we expect non-white workers to be paid? Well, the way we can think about this is we can think about what we can learn about one employer's decision based on their neighbor, right? So we know that somewhere out there in the world, there's an actual wage gap that comes out of the market, right? This comes from our assumption that labor markets are perfectly competitive, right? That's going to tell us that there's some market wage for white workers, some market wage for non-white workers. We also know, right, from back a couple pages ago, that what each employer is going to do when they're making their decisions is say, you know, as long as the difference between white wages and non-white wages is greater than D, I'm going to only hire non-white workers. If it's less than D, I'm only going to hire white workers, right? Each employer says, I'll call them employer J, right? If the wage for white workers minus the wage for non-white workers is greater than DJ, I'll hire non-white, right? In that case, my perceived costs are going to be lower hiring non-white workers. So if I knew that an employer at, say, the 80th percentile, right? If I knew that this employer was hiring all white workers, I could be pretty confident, in fact, completely confident, that the person in the 81st percentile or the 82nd percentile or the 83rd percentile is also going to hire only white workers, right? Because if I saw that this person's hiring white workers, I know that their level of discrimination has to be less than the difference between white wage and non-white wage. So even more prejudiced workers have to be, or more prejudiced firms have to be also deciding to only hire white workers. Likewise, right, if I saw that, you know, someone at the 20th percentile was only hiring non-white workers, then I could be very confident that even less prejudiced firms are also going to only hire non-white workers, right, for exactly the same reason. If this person's level of D, right, let's say $1, was less than the difference between white wages, or, less than the difference between white wages and non-white white wages, then anyone who has even less prejudice has to also conclude that non-white workers are cheaper. So what this can let us do is it can tell us that there's going to be some threshold employer, right, who has some threshold level of discrimination that's exactly equal to the size of this wage gap. Every single employer who's more prejudiced only hires white workers. Every employer who's less prejudiced only hires non-white workers, right? This person is the only person in the economy who's indifferent between hiring white workers and hiring non-white workers. Importantly, right, crucially, this D star here is going to equal the difference between wages of non-white and white workers, right? We're going to say that this wage gap has to be set by D star. So what this means is that who this person is, right, who this marginal employer is, it's going to matter a lot for determining the size of the wage gap, right, for determining the wage advantages of being white. So how is this marginal employer determined? Effectively, they're going to be determined by the relative supply of white and non-white workers. So let's imagine, to keep things simple, that every single person in the economy is going to work, right? We're not going to worry about this story here where at lower wages fewer people are employed. If 50% of workers in a particular city were black, then we would expect that the wage gap between white and non-white workers would be set by the 50th percentile of discrimination, right? The employer who is more prejudiced than half of available employers, less prejudiced than the other half of available employers. On the other hand, if we were in a different city, right, a different labor market, where only 5% of employees were non-white, of available workers were non-white, then the wage gap would be set by the 5th percentile employer, right? It would be set by this person here, right? The person who is more prejudiced than 5% of employers, less prejudiced than 95% of employers. So this has an important implication, right? What this model is going to predict is that if we think about the size of, the amount of labor market discrimination that occurs in equilibrium, right? The size of the wage gap between white and non-white workers in equilibrium, that wage gap isn't just going to be determined by how prejudiced employers are, it's also going to be determined by how many non-white workers are in a particular labor market, right? This model is going to predict that as the population of non-white workers increases, if prejudice remains constant, we should see a deepening of discrimination, right? An exacerbation of wage inequality. So for example, right, if we think about the Great Migration, when the number of black workers in northern cities greatly increased over a couple of decades, we might expect that the level of labor market discrimination in those northern cities would also increase over the period of the Great Migration. And for example, in Chicago, Chicago was about 2% black in 1910 and about 1/3 black by 1970. Over that time period, which is of course a very long time where a lot of other things were happening, but over that time period, Chicago went from being a city that was often described as a model of race relations to a city with very severe, as we've seen, right, housing and labor market discrimination against black workers. So one way of explaining this would be to say that the presence of a larger number of visible minorities activates or increases levels of prejudice. A different way of explaining this would be to say that if you're a member of a very small minority group, you can interact with the least prejudiced members of the majority group. If you're a member of a larger minority group, you're going to have to do business and interact with more typical members of the majority group, which is going to mean more prejudiced members of that majority group. Okay, right. So this is essentially Becker's employer model, right, in the short run. We're going to say that the gap between wages of white and non-white workers is going to be set by the level of prejudice for employers, in particular, the level of prejudice for the marginal employer, right? The employer who is, more prejudiced than all of the people who only hire non-white workers, less prejudiced than all the people who hire white workers. We're also going to predict that in a model, in a situation with perfect labor markets, perfectly competitive labor markets, we should see essentially perfect segregation of the labor market between white and non-white or majority advantaged and disadvantaged workers, right? With the reasoning being that if you can hire whoever you want, right, you can hire as many workers as you want of each type at the going wage, you're never going to have a reason to hire a worker of the less preferred type according to you. Of course, in the real world, we don't see this perfect segregation of the labor market. This was much more true of the 1950s when Becker was writing these models, which we might think of as evidence, we might be able to rationalize this by saying that we've got less than perfectly competitive labor markets, so that while prejudice of employers is one thing that might sort people into one job or another, there's lots of other factors that might override that in any particular instance. Cool. All right, one more quick point I want to make about this before I move on is that because of the fact that it's only the marginal employer who's going to determine the level of racial discrimination in a labor market, right, by which I mean the wage gap between white and non-white workers, the level of prejudice for non-marginal employers doesn't really play much of a role in the labor market at all. So for example, let's imagine that we had some employers who actively preferred non-white employees, right? We had some values of D that were negative, right? Let's say going to something like -$5. This would have effectively no consequences for determining this wage gap. The reason being that these employers are going to be hiring all non-white workers, even if they had zero prejudices whatsoever. So this is kind of a little illustration of this idea that racism is prejudice plus power, right? If you've got, say, a small number of employers who are themselves members of the marginalized group, who have active preferences for members of the same group, that's not going to result in discrimination against white workers, right? When it comes to your overall earning ability, rather than your ability to walk into a particular firm and get a particular job. Okay, cool. So now I want to shift focus from the short run, right? When we're thinking about what sets wage differences at a particular time to the long run. What this model might predict about dynamics of discrimination over time. And I should note, this is where the Becker model gets very, very controversial. To note here is that what this is implying is that every firm that hires white workers is going to make exactly the same decision about how many workers to hire and is going to have exactly the same profits. The reason for this is, as long as you're above the threshold of prejudice where you don't hire non-white workers, how prejudiced you actually are is essentially an academic question. Right? If this was, let's say, $5, right, the threshold level of discrimination, the person who would be willing to hire non-white workers if they were $6 an hour, cheaper than white workers, makes exactly the same decision as the person who would hire non-white workers if they were $10 an hour, cheaper than non-white workers. Okay. How about for non-white firms, right? Firms that do hire non-white workers? Well, they're going to do effectively the same thing, taking into account how much they perceive non-white workers to cost them. And in this case, right, because we think that some of these non-white firms are going to be prejudiced, this is going to depend on their level of prejudice, right? So they're going to maximize perceived profits, which is going to be the price times the amount produced, plus or minus the cost of a worker, we wage non-white, plus their discrimination coefficient, times the number of workers that they're going to hire, right? As a result, they're going to hire workers up until price times df dl is going to equal wage non-white plus dj, right? So this has two important implications. The first one is going to be that these firms are going to end up hiring more workers on average than are the firms that only hire white workers. And the way that we know that is we know that for every firm that hires non-white workers, the non-white wage plus their level of discrimination is less than the white wage. That's why they're hiring non-white workers, right? So if we've got, let's say, P times df dl decreasing, right? We've got a white wage up here. The white firms are going to hire here, right? If we've got a non-white wage here, a totally unprejudiced firm would hire here, right? This firm is going to hire there. If we've got some firm that's prejudiced, but not so prejudiced that they don't hire any non-white workers, they're going to make a hiring decision somewhere in between, right? Where this is going to be their D. Does this make sense? So one implication here, right? Less prejudiced firms hire more workers as long as they're hiring non-white workers. The other implication is going to be less prejudiced firms have to make higher profits, both higher perceived, emotional profits, also higher dollar profits, right? And the reason for that is they're hiring workers at lower pay and they're hiring more workers, right? So those things combined have to lead to higher profits for these firms than for the firms that are only willing to hire white workers. Another really important implication, by the way, this is a little bit off topic, but I think it's really, really important, is that because of the fact that firms that hire non-white workers end up hiring more workers than firms that hire white workers, even though the workers themselves are identical, we're going to expect the average non-white worker to be less productive in the labor market than the average white worker. The reason for this is purely because of diminishing marginal returns. In other words, it's purely because as we add more and more and more workers to the same production facility or the same production process, right, combine more workers with the same amount of capital, the consequence is going to be that workers become slightly less productive. So if we were, an empirical economist and we wanted to answer the question, are wage differences between white and non-white workers a result of those workers' productivity or a result of discrimination? and we had some way of measuring worker productivity and running a regression comparing productivity to wages, we would come to the conclusion that white workers and non-white workers were being paid on the basis of their productivity, right, from this story. That would be completely and utterly inaccurate if we wanted to know whether this was a consequence of discrimination, right, whether wage differences are a consequence of discrimination. One of the implications of this model is that what discrimination does is it lowers wages for non-white workers for exactly the same reason that it lowers productivity for non-white workers. This is a concept, by the way, right? It comes out of this model, but it was really explored in depth by an economist named Barbara Bergman in the 1970s, and has been a really important part of understanding wage gaps by race and wage gaps by gender. Okay, anyway, sorry, that was a little bit of an aside. I just had to throw it at you. So going back to the main sweep of this argument, right? What we just said is that firms that hire white workers are all going to make the same decision. They're all going to be equally profitable. Firms that hire non-white workers are going to be more profitable than firms who hire white workers because they're getting more workers at lower costs. And the less prejudiced you are, the more profitable you're going to be. We wanted to graph our level of profit by level of discrimination, right? So we wanted to put on here your level of D from, low value of, let's say, 0 to a high value of $10, right? The most prejudiced person in our economy here. Essentially what we would see, the profits are going to be highest for the least prejudiced firm up until we hit the point D star, which I think we said was 5, right? Just making up numbers, where we start hiring only white workers. So this is going to be firms that hire white workers. These are going to be firms that hire non-white workers. Right? This comes out of the fact that less prejudiced firms are paying less for labor because they're willing to take advantage of the fact that non-white workers are available at lower wages. So I promised that this was going to get to this controversial claim about the long-run dynamic of this economy. The controversial claim is the following. We generally expect imperfectly competitive markets with free entry and exit for economic profits to trend towards 0. In other words, what this means in real terms is that if there's some business opportunity out there that's better than all of the other business opportunities that a person could pursue, right? So economic profits are greater than 0. We expect that people are going to take advantage of that by jumping on it, right? By flocking into that business, opening stores, and generally trying to, partake in those high profits. The consequence of that's going to be that with more and more competition, right, for that business opportunity, profits are going to fall and fall and fall up until they reach the level of profit you can make by doing anything else, right? For exactly the same reason, if there's some business opportunity that's terrible, we expect people to flee from it up until economic profits reach 0. So that means that on average, profits here should be about 0. But we said they're lower for the prejudiced firms than for the less prejudiced firms. So we might have an average level of economic profit, something like 0. What this should imply is that in each year, when we have this disparity, some of these prejudiced firms are going to notice that they're doing poorly and decide to exit the market, right? It's not going to be worth it for them to participate in this market anymore. On the other hand, less prejudiced potential employers are going to look at this market and they're going to say, wow, I could actually make a lot of money here because of the fact that I'm willing to hire marginalized workers. And so if this happens often enough, right, if we iterate through, frequently enough, each time we iterate, we wipe out some of the most prejudiced employers, we expand some of the less prejudiced employers. Oh, I should have done it like that. I'm going to leave this here, but I'm going to draw a new distribution, right? We wipe out some of the less prejudiced employers. We bring in some more prejudiced employers. We should end up with a distribution of this D parameter that goes more and more towards low values over time. Right? So we get closer and closer and closer to wage inequality as a consequence. And as long as there's essentially an unlimited number of people able to enter this market who are not prejudiced, we should expect that over a long enough period of time, this level of discrimination should trend towards 0. In other words, as long as this disparity exists, and as long as there's people who benefit from the disparity, we should expect the market to become increasingly hostile towards the most prejudiced firms, increasingly favorable towards the least prejudiced firms. The reason that this claim is controversial is that this seems like a fairly obviously incorrect claim. When Becker was writing these models in the 1950s, this might have seemed somewhat reasonable, right? He was writing these models at a time when had very, very severe, legally sanctioned discrimination that was coming under increasing stress, right? There was increasing civil rights pressure to reduce legal barriers protecting discriminatory firms. And Becker might have thought, if we just get to a more competitive economy, right, the consequence should be that these vast wage inequalities that existed in the 1950s should shrink over time. What we've seen now is that those wage inequalities did shrink up until about 1980. They have not been shrinking since. On top of that, if we think about wage inequality by race or by gender around the world, we also don't see much evidence of this sort of disappearance of discrimination over time. Prejudice has continued to affect wages, comparing lighter-skinned and darker-skinned Brazilians, comparing white Europeans and non-white Europeans, comparing different caste groups in India, in all of the various circumstances we can look at where there's persistent, right, well-ingrained prejudices, it's hard to find evidence for this sort of a story on a large scale, on a grand scale. So this suggests that some of these assumptions are wrong, right? Either the assumption is wrong that we have a potentially unlimited pool of unprejudiced employers, right? Which might be the case if, at least in some businesses, the process of becoming wealthy enough to become an employer or develop the skills necessary to be in a firm, in an industry, might also result in being taught levels of prejudice. It might be wrong because labor markets aren't actually competitive, right? Or product markets aren't actually competitive. We don't have enough entry and exit in the economy to cause this to happen. It might be the case because discrimination is being constantly refreshed or sustained over time, right? So that even as there's this competitive pressure against discrimination, there's some other pressure pushing in the other direction.